These four slabs of marble, like giant tombstones, stand atop a hill on the campus of Kent State University. They commemorate an event that shocked the nation 25 years ago, the death by gunfire of 4 students during an anti-Vietnam War demonstration. It was the kind of incident that most Americans grew up assuming could never happen here in the United States. What were the circumstances that led to this tragic shooting? Why did this group of young people carrying deadly weapons shoot directly at a group of unarmed students their own age? How did the media react? How did the public react? And how did the American justice system deal with this incident? This program will explore the legacy of May 4th, 1970.
Yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Say it again, y'all. Look out. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing.
1970 was a turbulent time on college campuses across the United States. The Vietnam War had dragged on for years, and many students had decided that it was not a morally defensible war. It was a war that was never officially declared by Congress. It was a war to keep the popular communist hero of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, out of power. Many Vietnamese perceived the United States as yet another imperialist power interfering with Vietnamese affairs, attempting to keep a Catholic minority in control of a country that was largely Buddhist. One afternoon in the middle of the Vietnamese capital of Saigon, a Buddhist monk immolated himself as a way of protesting U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Scenes of the devastation caused by American bombing appeared on American television each night on the news. The American death toll began to mount. The Tet holiday in 1968 arrived, and the communists launched a major offensive that reached right into the heart of Saigon. Victory did not seem imminent, despite reassurances from U.S. military leaders. The lyrics to a popular rock song of that time asked, "What are we fighting for?" And many Americans began to wonder.
Yeah, come on, all of you big strong men. Uncle Sam needs your help again. He's got himself in a terrible jam. Way down yonder in Vietnam. So put down your books and pick up a gun. We're gonna have a whole lot of fun. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Ain't no time to wonder why we were all gonna die.
Well, come on, General, let's move fast. The old big chance has come at last. Gotta go out, get those Reds. The only good commie is the one that's dead. And you know that peace can only be won when we're going to all the kingdom come.
And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, there ain't no time to wonder why we were all gonna die. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, ain't no time to wonder why we were all gonna die.
Well, come on, brothers throughout the land, pack your boys up to Vietnam.
Come on, folks, don't hesitate. Send them off before it's too late. Be the first one on your block to have your boy come home in a box. And it's 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7, open up the pearly gates. Well, there ain't no time to wonder why we were all gonna die.
Anti-war demonstrations began occurring regularly, especially on college campuses, where young people questioned American motives in a war that they might soon be drafted to participate in. A so-called counterculture movement gained strength among young Americans, which culminated during the summer of 1969 in the Woodstock Music Festival. This social movement was marked by political activism, alternative lifestyles, sexual liberation, and consciousness raising through experimentation with drugs or meditation. This movement was viewed with suspicion and distaste by most members of the older generation and by many conservative young people. It was this group that most actively opposed American involvement in Southeast Asia.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their minds are getting so much resistance from behind. Time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. What a field day for the heat. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and carrying signs, mostly say hooray for our side. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Strikes deep into your life, it will creep. It starts when you're always afraid. Step out of line, the man come and take you away. We better stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going. We better stop now. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going. We better stop. Children, what's that sound?
On Thursday night, April 30th, 1970, President Nixon made a special appearance on television.
Tonight, American and South Vietnamese units will attack the headquarters for the entire communist military operation in South Vietnam. This key control center has been occupied by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong for 5 years in blatant violation of Cambodia's neutrality.
While anti-war activists sought de-escalation, this seemed an escalation of the war effort into a neutral country. In response, the next day, May 1st at noon, political activists at Kent State ceremonially buried a copy of the U.S. Constitution. That night, a warm spring evening saw large numbers of students enjoying themselves on Water Street in downtown Kent. a group of young people amassed in the street and set a large bonfire.
Pretty soon there was a large crowd in the street, and the street was blocked, and cars couldn't get through. Then the crowd was out there for a while, and a small bonfire was set in the street.
A handful of people started going up and down the street and smashing windows, and I remember, you know, even some of the voices that were screaming, you know, let's get AT&T, and, you know, the phone company was downtown, and a lot of times there are certain businesses or whatever that are targets that seem to have a connection with the war. And
ultimately, a total of 43 windows were broken. 28 of them were small windows in one bank. Then there were 15 other windows broken. There was a small amount of looting. I think it was inconsequential. And then the crowd was dispersed by the police.
People were upset and expressed that outrage in ways that I don't think even realized they were going to do until that moment.
This vandalism shocked the town of Kent, whose mayor Leroy Satram proceeded to telephone the local police as well as the Ohio National Guard. The guardsmen arrived in town the next day, and a curfew was declared prohibiting students from going downtown that night. Instead, a group gathered on the Kent State Commons. An American flag was burned in protest. Then the protesters turned to the old wooden building on the edge of the Commons that housed the Army Reserve Officer Training Corps offices. The crowd set the ROTC building on fire.
Well, at a certain point, the first student walked up and tried to burn a curtain. That failed. Railroad flares were thrown. I saw one Molotov cocktail that was thrown. Instead of it being thrown directly at the building so it would catch the building on fire, this student threw it at an angle so it bounced off the building, caught the ground on fire. So the attempts to burn the building were very inept.
Most students were just watching while a few people made some attempts to set the building on fire, unsuccessfully at first. And we left the scene to go back to Tri-Towers. We thought that it was over with. By the time we got back to the dorm, it was quite dark by then, and we could literally see from our 6th floor dormitory rooms the flames that were leaping up into the night sky. We could see them all the way, you know, across campus in Tri-Towers by then.
And I really think that by May of 1970, there was just a real feeling of desperation by the students and by many anti-war activists in America. And I really think the point of diminishing return had been reached, so that when there was a building that was being burned, you had 2,000 or 3,000 students next to Taylor Hall on the hillside cheering as the building was burning down.
When firemen arrived on the scene, they were harassed by the crowd, which blocked their access to the blaze and attempted to cut their hoses. They retreated, and the building burned to the ground.
Many ROTC buildings burned down that spring in America as students grew tired of marching, writing letters, chanting, you know, petitioning, begging for an end to that war. The actions turned a little more militant.
As similar incidents occurred on college campuses across the country, President Nixon announced,
You know, you see these bums, you know, blowing up the campuses. Listen, the boys that are on the college campuses today are the luckiest people in the world.
People felt that this was our way of sending a message to President Nixon, that we didn't want to send our ROTC cadets off to Vietnam to be officers in a war that was very immoral and very unjustifiable. So people saw that the building was a symbol of the war, and I think that's why some people didn't mind that the building was being burned.
This changed the whole character of protest and legitimated the National Guard coming in on campus.
The next day, Sunday, May 3rd, the National Guard moved on to the Kent State campus. Governor James Rhodes arrived and made a rousing speech at the local firehouse.
He says, when we're going to use every part of the law enforcement agency will hire to drive them out of Kent. We want to say that they're not going to take over campus.
On campus, things were relatively quiet. Students talked with guardsmen, and some even placed flowers in their gun muzzles. The governor had declared a state of emergency on campus, with any demonstrations forbidden, although some questioned the constitutionality of this proclamation. An anti-war demonstration had been called for noon on Monday, May 4th. Students gathered by the bell on the Commons.
The assembly was peaceful. We believed that it was a legal assembly. And when the National Guard leaders advanced on the crowd and read the riot act, it was met with surprise. There was no riotous condition, and students were defiant.
There was a line of guardsmen stretched across closer toward where the ROTC building had been, and the one guardsman on the end asked me a question. He says, "What is that you're carrying there?" And I said, "Just a couple of black flags." And he says, "Well, today we're going to make you eat those flags."
By the time several hundred demonstrators had appeared, the Guard was ordered to disperse the crowd. They fired tear gas and marched toward the demonstrators, who began moving up nearby Blanket Hill with its stone pagoda on top.
It was quite clear that the Guard had an agenda very early on to move against the students. And if this was true, we as faculty marshals should have been informed of this, and we weren't.
At a point in time, the decision was made that that rally had to be broken up.
For reasons still unclear, the troops proceeded to march down the hill and onto a nearby field used for football practice. At this point, some of the Guard pointed their weapons at the crowd.
I was waving a black flag of protest, and I was shouting at the Guard, and I saw some of them then begin to kneel and aim in our direction. Fortunately for me, they didn't fire at that moment.
They were shooting a tremendous amount of tear gas off.
A tear gas canister landed right at my feet, and I got a big whiff of tear gas and went into one of the nearby dormitories to catch my breath, put some water on my face. The tear gas had affected me so much that I thought that the rest of the students had been dispersed also.
The student group had been dispersed, but many of the protesters continued chanting slogans and yelling at the Guard. Some threw rocks at guardsmen.
And I remember grabbing some stones after my eyes were clearing up a little bit and just symbolically heaving them in the direction of the National Guard. There was no real feeling behind it other than frustration.
And I remember seeing, some picked up stones from the Dunbar Hall lot and started to throw them in the direction of the Guard on the practice field. It was momentary, and it was insignificant in that they fell short of the Guard because of the great distance between the student activists and the Guard, and many of the stones were picked up and thrown back in the direction of the students, and were really no threat to the Guard because they had on steel helmets and gas masks and this kind of heavy suited equipment.
Some of the students started throwing stones at the guardsmen, and it got bad enough at some point that we decided that we needed to move from there, because if not, we were going to have some serious injuries. So we turned and proceeded back up Blanket Hill, and with the intention of going back to the ROTC building.
They had succeeded in breaking up the original demonstration, and it appeared that they were returning to their original position back on the Commons. However, just as they reached the top of the hill, without any really noticeable provocation, a group of them turned and aimed their weapons into the crowd. The gunfire went on for 13 seconds.
Next thing I know, I got shot. I remember jumping on the ground, covering my head, and hoping that I wouldn't get hit anymore.
And in a short period of time, I saw them turn around and fire their weapons. I tried to get out of the line of fire but couldn't, was hit in the back.
And I knew that I had received some sort of spinal cord injury because of this shooting.
And as I saw them turn and point, and there was a firing started, I fell to the ground in this room. And as soon as I fell, a bullet came through the window and struck the window partition at the corner. It went into the metal, into the concrete. And had I been standing there, I would have been hit in the abdomen.
It was just, oh my God. And then the shooting stopped, basically. And then there was a little bit of quiet, and the chaos resumed again for a few seconds after the shootings, because here you had several thousand people standing around and seeing 13 people laying on the ground, bleeding. Some people dying on the ground.
I guess immediately after the shooting, I remember just walking around in a sense of a daze, in a sort of a daze. Disbelief, shock, and my recollection is that it lasted about 20 or 30 minutes, just milling around the crowd of students, seeing students lying on the ground, hearing some sirens in the background, and observing the confusion of the students and the confusion amongst the guard.
So I heard the firing. I immediately started to run up the hill, which would have taken me no more than a couple of seconds, but by the time I reached that portion of the line that was firing, the firing had stopped.
When the gunfire stopped, there was this silence that is almost indescribable. I mean, there is no question about it. We were in shock, just trying to comprehend what we'd just experienced. It took us by surprise. It took us by surprise. There was nothing happening as the guard made their ascent up the hill that could possibly justify what they did. And as we came out from behind cars and trees to perceive the damage done, it was just, it's mind-boggling, to be 19 years old and come out from behind a car on my college campus and turn around 3 feet behind me to see Bill Schroeder lying on his back with blood splattered on his neck and his shoulders, and staring up into the blue sky, so obviously gone. And then to look around and start hearing that silence just sort of disappearing, and all of these voices just, a moan and a cry and all these screams, and eventually ambulance sirens. And that's what I remember most about May 4th, was the confusion that resulted afterward. I mean, everyone wondering why, how could this happen, why, and running to help the ones who were lying there. And I will never forget seeing Bill and then looking over and seeing Sandy lying in the Prentice lot where she'd been dragged after she was shot through the jugular vein, and I didn't even recognize her. I knew her, but I didn't even recognize her. She was so gray by the time I reached her. I just remember glancing up at the hill and seeing these men going in the opposite direction. I mean, the Ohio National Guard, who were sent to our campus to protect life and property, had just taken life and walked away.
3 of us that I can recall ordered ceasefire simultaneously, and to get their attention, and obviously with the noise level, both of the shooting and the crowd, was to literally touch them on the shoulder, say ceasefire. It was reasonably obvious at that instant to me that the people were not going to continue advancing on the guard at all. They were either falling on the ground or dropping to the ground or leaving, running in the opposite direction.
When the shootings ended and I came out from behind that car after I saw Bill dead and then I saw Sandy dead, I remembered right at that moment where I'd last seen Alan would have put him directly in the line of fire. And so I just started running wildly, looking for anyone that knew him or that I knew him, and said, "Have you seen Alan?" And after several minutes, I was right at the foot of the hill where Jeff was lying, and there was so much blood, and it was streaming down the asphalt. I was looking at Jeff when my friend Eddie came up behind. He was one of Alan's roommates. He lived downstairs from Alan, and he said, Alan and Tom both got it. And I just assumed that he was dead. I mean, the first 3 people that I'd seen prone were dead.
And as they turned and started to fire, I was near the bottom of the hill, about 225 feet away. And I thought for a moment there, in that split second, I thought, well, they must be firing blanks. There's just no reason to be shooting now. And I thought, well, in case they are firing live ammunition, I'm going to get behind this tree here, which was just a few feet away from me, fortunately. And so I took a couple of quick steps, and as I knelt behind the tree, I felt a bullet enter in through the front of my wrist here, and it came out through the side. So the bullet went through my arm. And that was within, I think, the first second or maybe 2 seconds of the gunfire. So for the next 11 or 12 seconds, I stayed just behind the tree, and I was concerned about my wound. It was very painful and bloody. But my main concern was to stay behind the tree because I heard other bullets hit the tree and many other bullets zipping through the air on both sides of the tree going behind me into the parking lot area. So I knew I had to stay behind that tree, which was literally saving my life. And I think it's pretty clear that they were shooting at me intentionally, probably because I had been waving that black flag and shouting at them. I was one of the more visible and vocal protesters that day.
I remember it very clearly. The physical pain one forgets about, but it's very clearly stamped in my memory.
And I felt like I was going to faint from the shock, I think, in the car on the way, but I didn't. I maintained my consciousness, and I was just suffering some pain and discomfort. And by the time we got to the hospital, the guy dropped me off there on Meridian Street at the old hospital in Ravenna.
In the meantime, Alan is inside, lying on a stretcher, and he says to this a doctor that he said could barely speak English, how many were shot? And the doctor said to him, 4 dead, 2 girls. And Alan pointed to his hospital bracelet and said, see if one of them is named Camphora. And
probably about 10 years before I would go back to rock concerts or go back to large group gatherings, just for fear that something could happen instantaneously.
And I looked down the hill, and there were the guardsmen still lined up on the commons where it all began, you know, and I just started screaming murderers at them.
At first, rumors flew regarding exactly what had happened. Many of the early reports about the incident claimed guardsmen had been killed. Many stories about the incident included statements from members of the Guard that there had been sniper fire just before the shooting.
The first thing the general said was that there was a sniper.
I had received a radio message that the Highway Patrol was up in an aircraft, said there was a confirmed sniper on that building.
Of course, we had to wait many months until the FBI, the State Highway Patrol, and even the National Guard concluded their own investigations. Later on, we found out, of course, there was no sniper.
News stories often implied that a group of students had charged the Guard, but photographs of the demonstration, right up until the time of the firing, show that there were few students near the Guard at the time they shot into the crowd. In fact, the closest student shot was 20 yards away, and the closest fatality was almost 85 yards away.
I mean, you can actually see people walking nonchalantly between the student activists and the Guard at the time that the Guard are actually turning in unison to begin their killing spree.
To my knowledge, there aren't any photographs that show a student with his hands on a soldier ready to kill him.